Okay, well, let's get started. It is the top of the hour. It is 1 o'clock Eastern time, and it is a different time out west where it's still middle of the morning. I'm always jealous of having people from Vancouver on the line because they seem to get a lot more day than anywhere else in Canada somehow. Now, I know you wake up earlier, Howie. That's how you pay for it, but it's still, it just feeds into the jealousy and Schadenfreude that the opposite Schadenfreude that we always feel out here in the East as we welcome people from Vancouver. My name is Bill Dempster. I'm CEO of 360 Public Affairs, and we've been working extensively with the CanCertainty Coalition on a Hot Topics webinar series. I'm going to quickly show screen. We're going to have our friend Bob Bick, a co-founder of CanCertainty, help kick this off, and then I'll introduce our panel properly. So let me just get my the right screen share. Share screen. Okay. Bob, over to you to explain the Hot Topics webinar series and what CanCertainty is up to.
Sure. If you can throw to the slide up that has got the 4 events listed. So yes, a couple months ago, CanCertainty conceived of and started programming a series of 4 webinars focused on what we deem to be hot topics in health technology assessment. So many of you here today joined us on November 23rd for our first one, which was about the PCPA and implementation and provincial listings. And that one was hosted with Judith Glennie and Barry Stein. Today, of course, we're going to be talking about provisional funding algorithms and how stakeholders can participate in that process and how the process works. And then in 2023, in the new year, we're going to start talking about the issue of qualities and the willingness to pay thresholds that have been put in place by payers and health technology assessors in Canada. And then in February, we're going to be revisiting the topic of surrogate endpoints, a topic that CanCertainty hosted a special event on at the CAPT conference a few weeks back, and we'll be delivering a lot of that content to our patient stakeholders in February. So today we'll talk about funding algorithms, but that's the initial 4 that we focused on. But certainly in the new year, we'll also be looking ahead and trying to figure out what patients and other stakeholders could use education on with respect to hot topics in HTA.
Thanks very much, Bob. And you'll be back on as a panelist in the funding algorithms discussion to help level set on that, in large part because you have become such an expert on this issue for the last, I would say, 6 or 7 years since it first bubbled up in one of the the CDAC and the CAPCA days. One thing we would like to say too is a special thanks to the supporters of the Hot Topics webinar series. That would be Amgen, AbbVie, Merck, and Pfizer. So thank you for that. Without that support, this series would not be possible. Today's panel, I'll quickly introduce who we've got on the panel, and then I'll go through a few housekeeping details. We've got Bob Bick, whom you've heard. He's a consultant and CanCertainty campaign co-lead, one of Canada's preeminent patient access consultants to help navigate through some very challenging and I would say like multi-decision tree world from Health Canada right to patient access. Alexander Chambers is manager of the Rare Disease Patient Journey at Novartis Canada. Many of us know and got to know Alex, though, in her time at CADTH and actually at the PanCAN Oncology Drug Review system or part of the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. And Alex has been on many webinars. Although it says rare disease patient journey here, much of your experience, Alex, has been in the cancer world and on the health technology assessment and reimbursement aspects of that. And I can let you continue elaborate a bit further about your experience on this specific issue. Dr. Howard Lim is a medical oncologist at the BC Cancer Agency, and Howie, one of my favorite things that I saw just researching you on I think it was UBC's website, describes you as a cancer care innovator, an educator, and a hockey fanatic. And it's not really clear, which adjective is in which order at which time, but it's amazing what you're able to do and lead on oncology and genomics, especially in the gastrointestinal space. Lots of experience as well on treatment algorithms as they've come together. So let's get at some housekeeping items. We're going to try to save at least 15 minutes of the webinar for your questions. I'm talking about the delegates who have signed on. The chat panel is open. The Q's and A's panel is also open. So please use those two to engage with us, and I'll do my best to consolidate and bring forward those questions to the panelists. And if you want to address a question in particular to somebody, please say who that person would be. As well, another logistical or housekeeping item, this webinar is being recorded. It will be posted on the CanCertainty YouTube channel and SlideShare channel. So I know that that's the first question that we always get in the panel. Will you share the slides? And the answer is yes, they will be available in the coming days on the CanCertainty SlideShare and YouTube channels. So let's get at it. I'm going to just provide just a bit of background, and then Bob is going to go much deeper. Quite a number of years ago, the funding algorithm development process started to move into the pan-Canadian realm in terms of all jurisdictions except for Quebec. We'll get to that in a second, but as it happens right now, CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, develops funding algorithms that determine the place of therapy of cancer treatments on public drug plan formularies. Let me just rephrase that. They don't determine the place of therapy. They make recommendations to the provincial cancer agencies and cancer systems across the country, ex-Quebec, on where they recommend those therapies be used in terms of a line of therapy. And they're often in relation to an existing funded treatment, and they may impact the sequence of use for those existing funding therapies. So if you think about a funding algorithm as, you must try this first or be on that, and then you can get access to a funded course of treatment with drug therapy B. The other way that a funding algorithm can operate is a clinician may have multiple choices for that line of therapy. So it's not one or the other are always sequential. Sometimes there are opportunities for clinicians. The real idea is that they're intended to support provincial decision-making for funded drug reimbursement. So previously, probably one of the most interesting acronyms in Canadian health policy history, the Canadian Drug Implementation Advisory Committee, or CDAC, or as they like to call it, CDIAC, played this role. And this was a committee that was constituted under the Canadian Agency, or Canadian Association of Provincial Cancer Agencies, or CAPCA. That got transferred into CADTH in the summer of 2019, and we're going to talk about and hear a lot more about that shortly. But when it was part of CAPCA, CDAC represented payers and provided advice, the same idea on how and where new treatments would fit into funded reimbursement. And there were a lot of issues with CAPCA's process and how CDAC operated. Stakeholders were concerned that CAPCA's oversight could lead to more economic information or economic weight. And so one of the issues is that CAPCA, through the cancer agencies, are actually negotiating on the net prices for new cancer agents across all different therapeutic areas. And so when they see a new cancer medicine come into the system, they will have access to and know what the discounts are on others. and that may have had some impact on whether and when they think that this next cancer therapeutic should fit into the system. However, it was not clear when and whether the economic information was having that impact on the decisions. The CDAC process also did not include a broader clinician engagement outside of the clinical leads of provincial tumor sites. And overall, the process lacked transparency. It was very difficult to unpack and understand exactly which algorithms were being discussed or considered. There was no opportunity to comment or view a provisional algorithm. So I'm going to let Bob tell you about the good news post-CAPCA. Now, the one thing I will say, though, is the CADTH procedural guidelines does include an important continuing role for CAPCA. And maybe, Bob, we can talk a bit about that later. But over to you now to talk to us about the day today and how it works right now.
Excellent. Thanks, Bill. And thanks to everyone on the line for taking the time today to do a bit of a deep dive into how CADTH goes into developing provisional funding algorithms and how stakeholders can participate. So, I'll talk about the current algorithm process and some of the improvements that we've seen since the CDAC days. But let me preface this slide by saying that I believe treatment algorithms can have a tremendous impact on treatment access, and that we all should be paying a lot of attention to this process. Algorithms, as you mentioned, can be used to determine what treatments are available in any given line of therapy, and they can be used to determine how many lines of therapy are going to be available, and they can ultimately codify eligibility criteria. Now, when I say that, it's with the caveat that these are recommendations. Provinces do have the latitude to accept or not accept these recommendations, but generally speaking, they are accepting these recommendations. So a possible outcome of these projects is that products that are currently reimbursed for a specific indication may not find a place on a current algorithm. And if CADTH reviewers deem that randomized control trial evidence is required to inform a line of therapy, then later lines of therapy, particularly in these smaller incidence cancers, might be curtailed. So I'll talk a bit about that a little bit later on. But the important takeaway for patient groups here is that you should participate in stakeholder input opportunities with respect to provisional funding algorithms. And let me say that the current process is certainly better, as Bill mentioned, than the CDAC days. We now have a better process for consideration of clinical evidence, and there's now stakeholder input opportunities, and there is some increased transparency, but we have a bit of a ways to go on that. I'll get to that. So in the next 10 slides, I'm going to cover a few things. I'm going to cover the current process for developing provisional funding algorithms. I'm going to talk about considerations for patient groups and clinician groups for providing input. And then I'm also going to throw some thoughts in there about what needs to be improved in the current process. So next slide, Bill. So this is excerpted from the CADTH procedures. This is the funding algorithm process chart. And as you can see here, there are two funding algorithm processes. On the left, you see the rapid process, and on the right, you see the panel algorithm process. A panel algorithm is typically initiated when there are one or more drugs that may be impacted by the implementation of a new drug, and where clinical expertise is required. They're initiated by the provincial advisory group and are typically completed within about 3 months. A rapid algorithm is used when CADTH determines that a new drug will not alter the current sequence of drugs, and those projects are typically completed within 2 months of receiving a request from PAG to initiate that process. Next slide, Bill. So talking a little bit about panel algorithms, as you can obviously see, a panel algorithm is naturally more complex than the rapid process, and because numerous drugs may be impacted. The panel that is referenced in this is a clinical panel that is convened to advise on the provisional algorithms. Beyond the PAG and CADTH participants, these panels are comprised of clinical experts with expertise in the diagnosis and management of the condition for which the algorithm is required. One of our speakers today, Dr. Howard Lim, will talk a little bit about these panels, as he's previously been recruited by CADTH to be on a clinical panel to advise on an algorithm for liver cancer. Beyond the patient groups and clinicians, manufacturers, and all manufacturers actually whose products may be directly impacted by the algorithm project, also have an opportunity to provide input on the algorithm. But in this process, it's kind of a two-step process. For a panel algorithm, CADTH posts a scoping document. The scoping document details the indication of interest, along with the list of the various drugs that may be impacted by the algorithm. Stakeholders So that particular product will be posted, and stakeholders have 10 business days to provide written input regarding their perspective on the treatment algorithm and the place in therapy for the drugs impacted by the project. So just as a reminder, input has to be shared using the appropriate template. We'll show you that in a couple slides. But it is the scoping phase where stakeholders will want to establish their concepts with supporting evidence of what the algorithm should ultimately be. And about a month after the feedback window is closed on the scoping document, CADTH will post a draft provisional funding algorithm report. For that particular step, stakeholders only have 5 business days to provide feedback. I know it's a very tight timeline. So, my advice to you is that when it's posted, we've got to get right on it. And this is where you're going to see if any of the concepts that stakeholders have put forward, in the feedback to the scoping document will have any traction. We'll see what is included in the reports, and we'll see who provide input, the patient groups and clinician groups. But what's kind of missing is the details of what stakeholders proposed, and the evidence that they may have provided in their proposals. So that's the scenario that I think we have to do a little bit of work on improving from a CADTH perspective, a bit of transparency, but we'll get to that also a little bit later on. Next slide, please. The RAPID algorithm is a lot slicker. It's an abbreviated process where CADTH forgoes the scoping process and directly posts a draft provisional algorithm report for feedback. Again, there's only 5 days at this step to provide feedback on the draft report. But again, this is where they've deemed it to be a much easier to inject this new therapy that's received a PERC recommendation into the algorithm with very little disruption. Next slide, please. So here's a quick glimpse of the templates for input on both proposed scope, which is on the left-hand side, and the other template for feedback on the draft report. It's a bit confusing. There's a whole list of templates on the CADTH website. I know I was working with a colleague last week, and they had started work on the wrong template because it's pretty easy to grab the wrong one. So just be careful when you're selecting the template. But again, if you ever need any help, you can always reach out to me directly. I'm always happy to help on these things. Next slide, Bill. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how patient groups can set themselves up to participate. One of the things that I believe is that because algorithms are heavily dependent on evidence, existing treatment guidelines, and clinical practice, I think one of the opportunities for patient groups is to actually help facilitate clinician group input. Now, many of you do this already with respect to drug submissions. Again, since I mentioned previously, timelines are very tight with these feedback windows. Patient groups will want to activate their medical or scientific advisory boards immediately when a scoping document or draft report is posted. And patient groups can also assist clinicians in assembling, the group of clinicians to provide input to CADTH. And they can also work with the lead clinician who's been identified to sort of lead that clinician group with document control and editing, and maybe assist with the admin, including collecting the conflict of interest declarations, and of course that final step, which is uploading both the clinician and patient input on time. Next slide, Bill. So when I look at what patient groups can do for their specific input opportunity, it's my opinion that that patient groups can serve to endorse clinician input and existing treatment guidelines. But I also think the objective of the patient group should be to preserve and or extend lines of therapy, based on what currently exists. And of course, preserve or extend the options within each line of therapy. Evidence is key, however, and that is why I think mirroring expert clinician input is probably appropriate. But another area that I think that patients can really weigh in on is the area of ethical rationale. There's going to be circumstances where CADTH may deem that there is insufficient RCT evidence to support recommending a line of therapy. Now, in the absence of RCT evidence, there may be a strong clinical rationale for a line of therapy, but the RCT evidence just isn't there. In certain cases, patients may want to put forward an ethical rationale. So what do I mean by that? Well, if a clinical rationale exists for a line of therapy, but no RCT evidence, it may be because a number of patients that require a later line of therapy is very small, and that an RCT is just not pragmatic. So in some of these cases, there could be a very strong ethical argument to be made to provide these patients with treatment access. Next slide, Bill. So this slide and the next couple slides after that are primarily sort of focused on how clinicians who are considering providing input may approach this project, but they're also relevant to patient groups who are providing support to clinicians to ensure that the expert clinician insights are provided to CADTH on these projects. Next slide. So here we lay out some of the areas of consideration for providing input. Critically, thought has to be given to how the current drug being reviewed will impact access to existing therapies in an algorithm. A little bit later on, I think Dr. Lim will tell us of a case where a new treatment for liver cancer was introduced as a new standard of care for a first-line treatment, which effectively pushed the existing first line down to second line and the second line down to third, and how this resulted in CADTH determining that the existing evidence to justify third line was insufficient. That's a very complicated case. I'll let Dr. Lim address that one, but that's just a consideration that I think clinicians and patients have to apply to an algorithm when they're preparing their submissions. Next slide. So other considerations for clinicians and patients is the concept of clinical rationale. CADTH may, like I said, in certain circumstances, require RCT evidence to justify a line of therapy. Again, in a lot of circumstances, particularly in those circumstances with rare or less common cancers, this is going to be not realistic or pragmatic. So we have to really address this. So drawing on evidence demonstrating the efficacy of a proposed sequence of therapies from another tumor site may be appropriate in some cases, or there may be real-world evidence that has been reviewed by CADTH that demonstrates efficacy of a particular sequence. Like I said, there might be other sources of information that should inform a treatment algorithm that are not necessarily being considered upfront by CADTH. Next slide, please. So if a sequencing proposition is not in the current package of evidence being considered by CADTH, and the proposition is not presented in any way, the final treatment algorithm may not meet real-world clinical needs. Next slide. So to sum it up, I think it's very important that stakeholders pay attention to and participate in the patient and clinician feedback opportunities related to provisional funding algorithms. And I also think that maybe as a community, we should be advocating for improvements to the current system. So what are those improvements? Well, I think we have to really focus on algorithms not further delaying the reimbursement timelines of Health Canada approved treatments. Our last webinar, we addressed this topic, and I do believe there's some evidence emerging that these algorithm projects are actually delaying access even further. So I think maybe Alex might talk a little bit about how the interim process that CADTH had after the CDAC process, but before this process came into play, there was actually algorithms were developed in advance of the actual PERC recommendation for a drug, but they decided to do it afterwards because it was a pragmatic consideration that they were doing algorithm work for drugs that may not ultimately be reimbursed. So they thought maybe they were wasting resources, but now we have the potential of delaying access. I also think that we should be looking to try to have methodologies that allow for reliance on clinical rationale versus RCTs for later lines of sequencing. And I also think that we need to have some greater transparency built into the provisional algorithm process, particularly the reports, in alignment with CADTH's guiding principles, so that we can actually see how stakeholder impact or stakeholder input has had impact on these things. So now we're going to move on to hear some commentary from Dr. Howard Lim and Alex Chambers about how these algorithm projects can impact treatment access and how the process works from the perspective of clinicians that participate in the panels and the perspective of CADTH managing the whole process. So Howard, let me pass it on to you, and what do you think?
Yeah, so I was part of the HCC algorithm, and so we can talk just as a brief background. There's been a lot that's changed in HCC. We're largely a TKI based, so sorafenib was originally the first standard of care, and then along came lenvatinib, and excuse me, and this was deemed to be a non-inferiority study but less toxic. And then there are more standards of care that came along. There was second-line treatment, third-line treatment, and then a new emerging first-line treatment came along with the atezolizumab, bevacizumab. So it was felt that as newer first-line therapy trials read out, that we would be pushing the subsequent lines of therapies down the line. So after lenvatinib, sorafenib, there is regorafenib or cabozantinib. And if there is a new first-line therapy, then lenvatinib would become the second line, cabozantinib, regorafenib would become the third line. And that's kind of how most clinicians felt. There are some places in the world, like I think the US said, since there's not a lot of evidence, they said you can use any TKI and just change it around. So this is where they want to give us some, Cabot invited some of us to provide input about the clinical utility of the drug under review and what the impact was on the second and third line treatment options. So next slide. So from the clinician input, there basically in terms of sequencing prior to treatment, there was really no available data to suggest that current second line therapies would be less effective than lenvatinib, and it'd be reasonable to use regorafenib or cabozantinib post lenvatinib. So this is what the clinical input was towards treatment for HCC. So lenvatinib, sorafenib should be available in the first line. Patients should have the opportunity to switch in case of severe side effects from one of these drugs. Next slide. So in terms of implementation, it was first-line therapy should include the option of sorafenib or lenvatinib so that people could have options, and that's reasonable to treat patients with the first-line treatment of sorafenib after lenvatinib. Since most second-line trials also had sorafenib, and that in the future, if cabozantinib is funded, it could be a third-line treatment TKI as well. Next slide. So in terms of the final clinician guidance report, that it says regorafenib is approved in second line following sorafenib treatment. No approved second line treatments after lenvatinib. Some participants in REFLECT received second line sorafenib, and that the efficacy of second line HC3 treatments after lenvatinib are unknown. Further data may be available through observational trials. And says despite the lack of evidence, CGP acknowledged that there's no rationale to suggest that the efficacy of second line treatments would be influenced by the first line therapy. Next slide. Actually, we'll go back one slide, sorry. And so when we were devising up the treatment algorithm as atezolizumab, bevacizumab came out, the algorithm became really, if you receive atezolizumab, bevacizumab, you can go on to lenvatinib in the second line because there was some data post in the EMBRAVE study that patients received lenvatinib. If you were not eligible for atezolizumab, bevacizumab, say contraindication to immunotherapy or increased bleeding risk, you go into the other algorithm where it's lenvatinib or sorafenib followed by second line cabozantinib, regorafenib. However, if you are in the atezolizumab, bevacizumab arm and you receive funding, you're only funded now, as per the algorithm, to receive lenvatinib. You cannot receive, after lenvatinib, a third-line option of regorafenib or cabozantinib. And it was partly when we were going through this, as clinicians, we were asked, well, is there really phase 3 evidence, or was the evidence for, say, further TKI after immunotherapy? And the real answer is, well, there isn't any yet, because most of the trials were very modern and no one's really gone to the third line treatment line yet, but it would be very reasonable to still extrapolate that since they've been on lenvatinib, and you could say regorafenib, cabozantinib, post lenvatinib as in the second line option, now that just push it down to the third line. But because we didn't have the evidence, we were, it was felt that because the evidence isn't there, we can't necessarily say that, although that's the clinical rationale for it. And I think that has really locked the provincial funding or the funding recommendation into, if you receive atezolizumab, bevacizumab, you then only can get lenvatinib in Canada. Reflecting back on that process, what we were told is also that at some point we can always revisit this funding algorithm when newer data comes out. And even from a provincial standpoint, as new data has come out, I did submit, a proposal in BC to say, can we have funding for cabozantinib or regorafenib in the third line, because it's only be about 6 patients. And it's fed back that, well, because the CADTH funding algorithm is this, even though you have new data, the answer is no. So I think where the issue is, it's not very transparent. How do we revisit these funding algorithms as newer data comes out? And I guess the other part is it's very locked in terms of the provinces really follow these funding algorithms. So I appreciate that there needs to be some guidelines so that we are standardized across the country. But I think we've lost some provincial flexibility where, if there is an opportunity to fund something small, that the provinces could. And so where I find this process a little different, so I've also sat on the PERC recommendations where, as a new drug is funded, CADTH also invites us for putting in our input for the launch of a new drug to make sure that it is applicable to the treatment population. Clinical trials can have a very narrow focus. So for example, maybe it uses cisplatin, and now the new treatment is oxaliplatin, and we'd want to say a platinum-based therapy. So that way it can be broader. So extrapolating the phase 3 data. And I find those clinical recommendations tend to be probably it's more open to that. Whereas I found in this process, and maybe because from the ethical scenario of social justice, there seems to be more of an economic spin. And I don't know if it's trying to make sure that there's a certain level of evidence for funding, and at what point, and where I don't know, and still a bit opaque on, is what is that level of evidence that's needed in the future? Because there's never going to be a randomized trial of third line cabozantinib, regorafenib after immunotherapy. Like, they're not going to run that trial. We're going to have to try and pull some of this out of the phase 3 data or observational data. And is that going to be enough for these guidelines? And this part, I admit, I still don't know. So I guess from my perspective, where I struggle is when I sat in this, I felt a bit constrained when I'm trying to give an opinion that I found the evidence more of a handcuff to a certain degree. And so I think versus my other experience with CADTH is I think they allowed us to be a bit more flexible to make sure that when we are approving drugs, that it could be for a broader population. So I find the funding algorithm, and maybe there's a different guiding principle to that. I found it a little bit more restrictive, and that was just my personal experience. And this might have been different for some of the funding algorithms down the line. But I think that's how I found the process. Next slide. So
And that's it, I think.
Yeah.
Let's, I'm going to stop sharing now, and we're going to bring it back to the panel and pass over to you, Alex. And I want to just thank a couple of the folks on the line who are already making good use of the Q&A panel and the chat panel. We'll get to you very shortly, but just a quick question about some of the history of this. Why don't we start with that, Alex? Where did the funding algorithm issue and policy come from? What was it trying to answer from starting a number of years ago?
Yeah, no, so thanks, Bill, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. I know Bob talked about it already a little bit, but I think, when you go back and you look at CAPCA and their drug funding initiative work that they had done a number of years ago, that's where the whole idea of CDIC came out. And I think the challenge that CAPCA was facing is that there were a number of new therapies entering the market, and PERC and PCODA, we were making recommendations, but the recommendations are made in isolation. And what CAPCA needed was to understand, how does everything fit together? And just as Dr. Lim had just mentioned, when you don't have the evidence. And so what's really interesting to me is that when this process started, it really was to try to figure out, there are gaps in evidence, but we all need to find a way forward here. And so turning to the expert clinicians to help fill in those gaps. And I do think that was the original intent. And some of the work that Dr. Sadev and I had published earlier this year, looking at some of those recommendations from 2017 up until last year, 2/3 of those recommendations had a question about sequencing and that gap in the evidence in terms of sequencing. And so, a lot of credit goes to CAPCA for finding a solution and implementing a solution, because we know how hard it is to sort of get things off the ground. So, I think it was a tremendous first step, and I think CADTH has taken it on. But just listening to what Dr. Lim was saying, I do think, is it now time to take a pause and think about, okay, is this working how we had originally intended? And how do, as these evolve, how do you update them? Because it's constantly evolving and new therapies are being entered.
Yeah, thanks very much. So that you're agreeing with Howie's assessment that we need to be a little bit more nimble or agile, potentially in cases where you don't have that evidence. And Bob, you mentioned that right off the bat as well. During that transition, when CADTH took over the algorithm process, Alex, was there any of the elements of the P-coder process that really helped fill in some of those gaps in terms of the engagement with the patient and the clinician community, to be able to do that and adapt what CAPCA had tried to do? Can you tell us a little bit about how and whether P-coder actually brought something to bear in that transition?
So, when CAPCA first introduced CDIC and started doing the algorithms, I think there were a lot of questions, and Bob already spoke to the fact that, there wasn't a lot of transparency in the process. So when it did move to CADTH, there was an opportunity to find a way to make it more transparent, to be more engaging of the different stakeholders, which again has been, it has been good that, they've found a way to ask for that input. But as Bob has mentioned, I think there might be some even sort of simple ways to even be a bit more transparent. The one thing that I think I've noticed is that you ask clinicians and patients to do all this work and to provide this input, but it's never posted. Like, that information isn't shared. So it's unclear, like not everyone gets to see what the clinicians have said or what the patients have said, and how CADTH has actually taken that information and applied it to the algorithm.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alex. That's great. We're almost at the time when I was going to open it up to folks, and there's a flurry of questions and comments. So thanks to those on the line, and let's jump to the chat in particular. We're already engaging with folks there, and I'll work my way backwards. Louise has a good question to you, Bob. Is CanCertainty developing a submission to CADTH around these changes or how they're adapted? Is maybe, Louise, what you're asking is, is this CanCertainty Hot Topics webinar series, is there anything that's going to maybe spin out of this? And of course, Louise is looking for potential templates or notes that she could help amplify through her many organizations that she's involved with too. Bob, if you want to jump in there, that'd be great.
Sure, absolutely, Louise. And of course, Louise, you specifically already had a bit of a preview on this topic because we worked together on one sort of very targeted advocacy piece where we included some issues around algorithms and where we could see some improvement. But it is our intention to do something more formal and to actually include some of the things that we've heard today already about, like Dr. Lim mentioned, that there is no process to revisit algorithms when new evidence emerges. So like I'm developing a list, and absolutely we'll put together a draft submission in the new year to be circulated to the CanCertainty Coalition and to review. And yes, we do intend to advocate to CADTH to adjust and improve its current algorithm process.
Okay, excellent. We've got and how we doing? You're doing like really good work in the Q&A panel, getting back to people, so they're actually jumping from open to answered. But I want to bring them out because they're not going to be posted in the YouTube version of this afterwards. And Deb asked some really good questions. Your co-founder there, Bob, around looking at the algorithms through that equity lens, and potential impact on patients if the sequence choice pushes a patient onto an oral cancer medicine. And in certain provinces, that won't be funded. Not everyone lives in British Columbia, where the cancer agency is a soup to nuts approach to everything from antiemetics to oral to intravenous. It's all through one-stop shop. Especially in Ontario and East, that's not the case. You know, is there an opportunity for Cateth to take a differing approach based on how cancer drugs are actually funded and used across the different jurisdictions? And Alex, maybe you can jump in here too.
Well, I'll just comment. It's a fantastic idea, and of course, Deb also kind of got CanCertainty for a big chunk of 2022 and a little bit of 2021. We were actually doing CanCertainty submissions for all drugs that were oral drugs to highlight the differential access issues province to province, so that the expert review committee would be actually aware of these differences. And I think it's a really good idea to have that patient lens, which patient we're focusing on, so that we can actually highlight these issues from an algorithmic perspective as well, province by province. So Deb, I'll take that as advice. And you know, obviously for Kidney Cancer Canada, but also as far as trying to inform our coalition on best practices, I think we'll take that one forward.
Yeah, thanks. Howie, Alex, do you want to jump in here?
Sorry, I was typing. But yeah, yeah, I think so. I admit when I was doing, whenever we sit down to do this, I think sometimes those issues will pop up for consideration. But I think, because you're right, most Western provinces, I think, because I know Alberta also covers oral, I think Saskatchewan does as well. So it depends who's sitting there. Most of the time we're like, well, but I do think it's a very important thing to consider for Ontario and the Eastern provinces. I just don't know how, like, it ended up not, we focus more on the science part to say this is what we would recommend. But we tried to be flexible to allow it so that if there could be some equipoise, and maybe an IV drug could be used instead of a TKI, so that it would allow clinicians some flexibility to help with that patient access.
So that's my original point about some algorithms. It's not there's an or Bayesian opportunity there, right? Not like a single medicine in that line of therapy, giving clinicians more choice. And then there was a follow-up from Deb about if you get access to a TKI first line, what happens down the line? Would you then be able to give them immunotherapy, or maybe try a different immunotherapy further down the line? Are there still examples where if you have access to one type of oncologic early, that will prevent you from getting it in a later stage of your cancer or later line of treatment?
So for HCC, it's a bit different. It's more, you're on the TKI because you have contraindication to immunotherapy. So most times you wouldn't get immunotherapy afterwards. And when it launched, if you were on a TKI first line, you were given, at least in BC, we were given the option to switch patients. So if I had a patient on lenvatinib who had not progressed on first line treatment, they could be switched over to atezolizumab, bevacizumab, so that they're not lost the opportunity because of timing of when they got their cancer. They would have the opportunity to be flipped over. But let's say today, if I had an HCC patient, I have to choose, do I want to use immunotherapy or a TKI? And most people only choose a TKI if they have contraindication to immunotherapy. So then that's why they don't get immunotherapy later on if you're on a TKI.
Got it. Thank you. Yes, you can tell that I am not the clinician on the panel. Alex, any thoughts on Deb's points and questions around about these lines of therapies and the equity challenge?
I think it's a really good call out, and I think it does need to be considered. But I guess even just listening to Dr. Lim, at the end of the day, patients should be getting the best treatments available, and they shouldn't have to sacrifice a therapy because the province doesn't pay for oral therapy. Like I do think the issue is still, they should be getting the oral therapies, but absolutely, should there be an equity lens, I think it would be worth considering. It's just how do you do that, and does CADTH have the expertise to do that as well? Because that's just one more thing. Bob's talking about timelines and everything. Like, it's important, but how do you incorporate it and still maintain the timeliness?
I also wanted to say, I think we need to move away from labeling things as a line of therapy so that we're not stuck. I think in this example, if we said regorafenib should be used post lenvatinib, then it's not a line of therapy. We're not talking about a first or second line. So if another line pushes it down, you have the algorithm built in that way with your approval. Versus if you say something's a first line treatment, second line treatment, and it gets stuck, it should really be post whatever you think the previous treatment is. And it allows more flexibility versus saying this must be in the first line, this must be in the second line. It should be whatever post therapy.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept and idea. And I want to bring it back maybe to you, Bob. You're helping folks bring together input at the pan-Canadian level at CADTH on these algorithms. How does that fit into the provincial algorithm database? I always imagine that at Cancer Care Ontario, there's a shelf with binders across all the different tumor sites. And that, I come from old school, remember in legal world, you slip sheet things, right? As things change and you get them in the post as you're building out your textbooks. Of course, this is all digital now, but how do these recommendations that are coming out of CADTH actually get into the cancer agencies? And then how are they referred to by clinicians in making these determinations from your experience?
Well, this is all posted on the CCO website in Ontario, obviously. What's interesting about this is actually there's a bit of a collision. So the disease site groups are actually providing sometimes clinician input on the proposed algorithm, often with a different view as to what's the final actual report. And yet they're the ones that are kind of implementing recommendations at the other end, or advising CCO on how they have to be implemented. So it's this weird little eddy, this little whirlpool that happens right now in Ontario specifically. I'm not sure how it necessarily works in some of the other provinces, but Ontario, I think is taking up these recommendations almost with great consistency from CADTH. So they're often in direct conflict with what their disease site group experts are actually saying. So it's a peculiar situation.
And are there workarounds? We actually had one of the questions, and we're always very careful, not to provide any advice on specific situations or medicines, but the question was, what if you get a no funding decision on a request that I can only imagine came from the clinician, or at least supported by the clinician? Are there any opportunities for appeals or exceptions to be made that would somehow allow for more clinical judgment to prevail versus the funding algorithm that's been determined?
Well, there's in Ontario, there's the EAP. There's a couple of these mechanisms in some of the provinces where there is an opportunity for clinicians to specifically request under certain circumstances, but they're very narrow, and I don't think it really applies to this one, right? It's generally speaking, when in Ontario, if the expert committee in Ontario hasn't considered it, there's a little bit of a window opportunity there, but I don't think there's too many workarounds from this. If a province has adopted the funding algorithm, I think they're sticking to it.
Any more flexibility out west, Howie, in your experience?
So it's a big loaded question. So there is what we call our compassionate access program where you can apply for, say, some circumstances which might be a little outside. I also sit on that board as well to look at that funding issue. Now, the part of the issue is you can't go too far outside the Health Canada indication. And part of that is because we have negotiated contracts with the companies for our rebates. So let's say, I don't know, there is some case reports of immunotherapy in a rare subtype of our sarcoma. But if we decide to try and fund that, we don't get our rebate because we're outside the Health Canada indication. So then the province ends up paying much more money for that drug. So then it becomes a budgetary issue beyond the evidence issue. So sometimes, even though the evidence may be weak, but let's say it's a cheap drug, sometimes we'll say that's not a problem. So there's that part of the complexity of the exceptional funding about how much does that affect our contracts, as well as then the data itself, like how robust is the data, does it make sense? There is still some leeway within the funding mechanism, but it requires a lot of going through, and there's a committee in BC that looks at that. I know Alberta, they have something called the director's privilege who reviews things. So I think each province has their own way of looking at this.
The question in the chat panel did note that outside of Quebec, because as folks know, Quebec has a Passion d'Exception, which is a separately adjudicated clinical panel, especially for funding requests that are outside of the list of funded drugs. So Quebec has got that. I've always called it a relief valve, or you know, and it does set that province apart. Alex, any other thoughts about, you know, if it seems to not fit in that within that algorithm, you know, what can patients and clinicians do potentially to get access if they feel that's the best treatment course? To build on what you earlier said was, you know, patients need to get the best medicine for their specific condition.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much more to add than what Dr. Lim already said. I think, you know, the recommendations from CADTH are not binding, so the funding algorithms also aren't binding, but we know that that, you know, provinces do try to adhere fairly closely. So yeah, I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah. And I've actually been asked to look at, you know, the Ontario system more recently, and I've seen some of the denials from the executive officer or the Ontario Public Drug Programs, and they are pretty, you know, black and white decisions with very little information in terms of the reasons for denial in many cases. So you know, this is maybe something, Bob, that we'll want to bring back as part of an outcomes report from this webinar. We've got about 7 minutes left, and actually, as we said when we were preparing for this, I don't mind ending these early. Often there's a protocol, we always go for an hour, but if we've sort of mined this issue enough, we can end a few minutes early, and that's perfectly fine, and keep the conversation going offline. But Bob, why don't I turn it back to you to sort of sum up some of the you know, your reflections on what we've heard today on the funding algorithms, and sort of if you had a top, you know, 3 wish list, wave your magic wand, Bob, what would you want to see? You're rubbing that lamp, and you got 3 wishes. What are they?
Sure. So I think, you know, one thing that occurred to me today, and I was texting Dr. Lim in the chat here about that, was that, you know, first of all, I think we'd want to have an ethicist on these panels, these clinician panels for algorithms, because, you know, he had mentioned that, you know, in BC, when they were looking for a third line treatment, there was only 6 patients in the province per year that would be potentially accessing that treatment. You know, I think we mulled this out before, like, you know, there'd be 25 or 30 patients across Canada that a third line would be, you know, be impacting. So we've now denied 25 patients per year in Canada that have liver cancer access to a third line of treatment because there's no RCT. So I think we have to have some ethical considerations here beyond, you know, RCT considerations. I also think, you know, what I heard today from Dr. Lim is that there is no good mechanism for revisiting an algorithm when new evidence emerges. So I think we actually need to have some sort of, whether it's some sort of, you know, rapid algorithm mechanism for, when the emergence of new evidence to inform, some greater flexibility or a small change. I think we want to see that as well. And of course, what we previously talked about, is that that there maybe perhaps be some greater consideration for the idea of a clinical rationale. We heard, in the case study today that, in HCC there was a new standard of care in the front line, which pushed everything down to second and third line. Well, we know that there was a rationale for cabozantinib to follow, lenvatinib when lenvatinib was first line and second line. Why wasn't that rationale accepted for when it got pushed down one line? So I think, we have to talk about clinical rationale beyond RCTs to be considered more thoroughly when we do this. So those would be some of the areas I think the process could be involved. And I also think, my big wish is that patient groups and clinician groups pay a lot of attention to what's going on here. That when they see patients, like, get the medical advisory boards active right off the bat, get their experts who are involved with, that are involved with, developing clinical guidelines to focus on this. The ones that are involved with the clinical trials, get them focused on this and to understand where the implications are for treatment access.
Excellent. That's four. I gave you 3 wishes, but you took 4, and there'll probably be more after this. I mean, while we're at it, Howie, the lamp is over to you. What would you like to see if you had a wish from the genie?
So the other thing I think actually for the flexibility piece to be able to treat more patients is probably to have the shackles taken off of our contracts so that we could apply some of our rebates to patients for these exceptional cases. Because I think that's part of the issue is the cost piece. I do agree with Bob about having probably a more transparent ethical framework about the social justice piece about the funding, because we're very used to clinical ethics about the patient in front of us, but what about the institutional ethics of CADTH? And how does this work about cost, funding, and the evidence? Because I find the evidence bar changes depending on the cost. So if you're talking about a drug that's $100,000 a year, then all of a sudden the bar seems to be higher. If it's only $100 a month, and then the bar is lower. And where does that fit? And I think just probably more, I guess, an easier way of making sure that feedback can get into the system so that it turns over quickly. And the fourth would be quicker access for patients where we can use real world data to start making more health economics decisions.
Thanks, Howie. And on the issue of contracting, that's a really interesting call out to the folks on the line. And we have people from CADTH listening, and of course the drug developers and manufacturers. So I don't know if we have the cancer agencies and folks from the PCPA listening, but maybe, I don't know, Alex, do you want to respond a little bit to some of the contracting issue that Howie raised? I know that could be a sensitive question, but any thoughts that you feel you can contribute?
No, so I think it's an interesting point, and definitely one worth considering. Again, if we're talking about these funding algorithms, I think, I think the flexibility is key, and maybe that sort of ties in to the contracting. And I was really excited to see at CADTH's information session last week that they are starting to look at the time-limited recommendations and the idea of reassessment. So maybe that can fall into these funding algorithms as well, and they can look at, those processes to update the funding algorithms as well.
Excellent. Any final thoughts, Alex? I gave wishes to your other panelists. You should get a couple yourself if you'd like.
So, I'm aligned with what's already been said, so I won't duplicate it. But just to reiterate that I do think it's exciting that CADTH is looking at these time-limited recommendations, and I do think it could have implications for the funding algorithms, which I think is fantastic.
Okay, excellent. I saw some people on there, lots of agreement about an ethicist, and it was Deb, we need a lawyer. And I think they were pointing at me or something like that. And it's like, I'm thinking about, was it Tina Turner? We don't need another hero. I think, a lot of these things, we don't need another lawyer. But what we do need is some really smart folks on a line talking this through with experience, which is really what we had today. So, Alex, Bob, Howie, thank you so much for your time and expertise and constructive input on I would say an ongoing challenge, but it's a lot less of an onion than it was just a few years ago. So yeah, hats off to Kenneth, I would say, to being open to, regular reassessments. Even preparing for this, we noticed, the process guidelines at CADIF does include some criteria for consideration around prevalence and patient populations where you can't get the level of data. So I think either they made those changes very recently and they're listening to us and they made them like live, but it is obvious that CADIF is making some real strides to address some of these issues that we've raised today. So hats off to them. I'm going to quickly share screen one last time because we've got to put a plug in for the next webinar, which is going to take place on January 24th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And it's going to be on quality adjusted life years, or QALYs, and how cost effectiveness thresholds impact patient access to some novel cancer treatments. So get ready for that. I can't believe we're even talking about 2023, but there you go. And this is maybe, Bob, over to you to sort of close it out on behalf of CanCertainty, and then we'll end the webinar.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Bill, for being such a capable MC again today. And thank you for our guest speakers, Alex Chambers and Dr. Howard Lim, and for all the participants to have come on today to again do a bit of a deeper dive into a topic area that I think is very important for treatment access advocacy writ large. So again, if we don't see you, some of you people over the next few weeks, have a great Christmas and a great New Year, and we'll see you in January for our next webinar.
Thanks very much. Bye, everybody.